So I felt it would be remiss of me not to say something about these latest tensions around Taiwan. Um, I think this is a sort of situation that's going to build up over time, and indeed it has been. I don't think we're necessarily going to see any exact moment that's some big dramatic event, um, because I think even the Chinese side, that is the PRC, the big China, so to speak. I think they recognize that a full land invasion of Taiwan um, would not only, you know, send alarm waves across the world and trigger a major response. I think they know that it's practically very difficult. An amphibious landing, it can't be like a Normandy style landing because Taiwan's a largely urban society. As I understand it, it's difficult to penetrate that way. And then PRC troops would be bogged down in a ferocious guerrilla war. You know, uh, I think they know that practically that would be very difficult. So if there's going to be any sort of assault on Taiwan, it's likely to be more in the form of an embargo, cutting off Taiwanese trade with the rest of the world. It would still get a response, but not quite the same thing as an armed attack, the way Russia attacked Ukraine. And that's perhaps where the differences are. It may well be why China is sort of taking its, on paper, neutral stance on Ukraine. In reality, of course, it's pro-Russia, but I think what China's doing is looking at Ukraine very sort of not passively, certainly, but looking at how this plays out. I think that's been the case for some time. Um, I saw an interesting debate the other night on Al Jazeera, and it was involving three people. An American academic, I didn't catch her name, who's critical of Beijing's maneuvers. A young editor, Brian Heo, of the New Bloom magazine based in Taiwan, and Victor Gao, who is very pro Beijing, based in New York City. Ironically, he's a Chinese hawk. But it was quite an illuminating debate. I have to say that Mr. Heo made an excellent point. He's a young guy, I'm guessing a lot younger than myself, probably in his 20s, but he made a lot of good points. And one of them was to Victor Gao, and it was this question: is mainland China really willing to send lots of young Chinese soldiers into a very costly armed conflict for a territory that no one or very, very few people want to be part of Greater China? In other words, it would be a very futile experience. Um, Victor Gao's response was illuminating. He kept regurgitating the same lines about Taiwan as part of China, Taiwan as part of China. And I think he revealed something. He claimed that the fact that the United States recognizes one country, two systems proves that there is no cause to be made. But as was pointed out by the American academic, I missed her name unfortunately, she also made strong arguments. That was a mischaracterization of the American position. The American position is that they recognize that as Beijing feeling on the matter, not that they agree with it. Um, Now, this is a complicated issue and it goes back decades and decades. We can go back to the end of the Chinese Civil War in the late 1940s when the communists won and the nationalists of Kuomintang went to Taiwan, which is why to this day the island is formally known as the Republic of China. And I believe it was 1973 that a UN vote was finally made on uh, which representative which group of representatives could be called the true China. Um, the United States and a number of other countries did not recognize the communist delegation, um, but most of the world, including the United Kingdom, recognized the communist delegation as being the one legitimate voice of China. Now, over time, particularly in the 21st century, I've come to feel that was a serious mistake. I understand that Cold War politics came into it. I understand that probably the practicalities came into it. But I can't help but feel, was it wrong for the British to recognize the communist regime of China. I mean, I suppose, if we look back to the Attlee administration in 1949 or the Heath administration in 1973, they were probably weighing up, well, it's better to recognize them and work with them rather than having prolonged tension. And that makes sense. That's a practical approach in the short term. But what we've seen with China in the 21st century is far from reforming, it's only got more and more belligerent, more expansionist, more nationalistic. And I think Victor Gao's rants, basically, that's what I'm on to, expose that. Um, there was two guys interviewed on the streets of Shanghai, and they basically said, if the translation is correct, this was an interview on the BBC World Service. All the big networks was covering this story. Um, they don't care what the Taiwanese think. It doesn't matter what the Taiwanese think. Taiwan's part of China. Now let's just, I just go to this very briefly because I don't think it's comparable. Let's just say that Humza Yousaf in Scotland unilaterally declared Scottish independence. And let's say reporters from around the world were to come to a city in England and say, what do you think of this? And let's say the British Army was to conduct some sort of military drill near the Scottish border. And let's say people in England or Wales and Northern Ireland said it doesn't matter what the Scots think, Scotland's part of the United Kingdom. That would be unthinkable, right? Scotland's part of the UK because that was what the people of Scotland chose in 2014. And there's a lot of other arguments around that. But a British government would not use force to put down the will of the Scottish people. It would not happen. Um, Rather, we use legalities and rational arguments. And I think that's why also the corruption of the S&P also factors into that. But anyway, that's it, it's just to show the Chinese mindset is ultra nationalistic. And I think it's very obvious that where ideological communism has failed, that is the Marxist Leninist ideology of communism, what what Beijing really has been relying on in recent years, and I've seen this firsthand, is ultra nationalism and expansionism. Ironically, 80 years on from World War II, we see a major Asian power that's getting increasingly hawkish and increasingly nationalistic and expansionist. But we're not talking about Imperial Japan, we're talking about the People's Republic of China. So it's almost like an echo of history, except this time it's China. Um, and this has been building up over years, the disputes over the island, the Chinese building of artificial islands. And I hear some of the same arguments from critics of the West. Oh, well, this is all American provocation. Um, I think that's very wrong footed. I'm just going to read a little bit from the Times because they had a very good analysis on this. They, Last night, the PLA said that its combat readiness patrols have been successfully completed and have comprehensively tested the capabilities of multiple units under combat conditions. It added, the troops in the theatre are ready to fight all the time and to fight at any time, resolutely crushing any form of Taiwan independence, separatism, or foreign interference. It denounced the presence in the South China Sea of the USS Milius, a guided missile destroyer that sailed close to Mischief Reef, one of the Spratly Islands. China has converted the low reef into a concrete-covered military airstrip and insists that the 12 miles around it are its territorial waters. Well, this is an example of the sort of artificial territorial building. The US is one of many governments which rejects these claims. Features like Mischief Reef that are submerged at high tide in their naturally formed state are not entitled to a territorial sea. I mean, it's almost laughable what the Chinese are doing if it wasn't so serious. The US 7th Fleet said in a statement, the land reclamation efforts, installations and structures built on Mischief Reef do not change this characterization under international law. It added that the freedom of navigation operation upheld the rights, freedoms and lawful uses of the sea. The PLA said the ship that had illegally entered Chinese waters and its forces had monitored the vessel and it's issued warnings. China has indisputable sovereignty over the islands in the South China Sea and the surrounding maritime areas, it said. Um, Chinese invasion, this is an analysis from the Times. The main report, by the way, is by Richard Lloyd Parry, who's a very experienced journalist. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be one of the most dangerous and consequential events of the 21st century. An event that would make the Russian attack on Ukraine look like a sideshow by comparison. It would quickly have ramifications far beyond the island, drawing in Japan, South Korea, and the United States and other countries of NATO. I mean, basically, it would draw in every major power in the Indo-Pacific region. Vietnam would be brought in. Philippines would definitely be brought in. It would really be a major event. I don't think China's going to risk that. I don't think they're going to go for a full ground invasion because it's very practically difficult. It would be very bloody. And, despite all the rhetoric, they know that there would be a massive international backlash. Of course, there's differences. Taiwan isn't universally recognized as a sovereign state the way Ukraine is. Um, and I think that's a great pity. Some will say that Tsai Ing-wen, she's been provoking Beijing with her visits to, and the Americans have been provoking Beijing by inviting her, by going to the US Congress and so on. I think that actually some of this is domestic politics. She's showing toughness and resoluteness, where her predecessor was basically an appeaser of Beijing. Um, and I think that has to be factored in. She has every right to visit the United States. She's not a servant of Beijing. Um, and the United States has every right to invite whoever it sees fit. Um, Apparently, next month there's going to be a big military exercise, naval exercise between the United States and the Philippines. Now, again, there'll be people who say America's deliberately provoking China. And I think, thinking of my country, I think of the plot of the film Tomorrow Never Dies, 1997. It was one of the Pierce Brosnan Bond movies with Michelle Yeoh playing a Chinese operative. And the basic premise of that is there's a naval war triggered between Britain and China, engineered by Media Mogul. Anyway, this is very real. There are very real tensions in that part of the world, and more often than not, there are run-ins where you hear sort of this uh, counter um, counter communication between one navy to the other. You see the same with air forces. Um, I think a direct conflict between China and the United States is unlikely, but I think this could escalate, and it's quite concerning. Um, I mean, these huge military drills that Beijing's been conducting, showing missiles raining down on Taiwan, showing Taipei and Kaohsiung in flames. That's really a convincing way to show China's peaceful rise. It's really a convincing way to show the Taiwanese people that it's better living under communist rule. And this is the thing about tyrannies. Um, it's basically a bully boy force. We see it from Russia. Certainly, it was the case for Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It's this idea that we don't really care what the international community thinks. We don't really care if we look like the bad guys, as long as we get our way. Um, and it's obscene. I think Hong Kong was sort of a testing ground. As much as it is utterly tragic what's happened in Hong Kong, Hong Kong's a lot smaller than Taiwan. Hong Kong's a territory of 7.5 million people. Taiwan's what, 28 million people, and it's a whole island with several cities. Greater Taipei is about the same size as Hong Kong, so stakes are even bigger. Um, I mean, I think it was easier for the CCP to control Hong Kong than it was, or than it will be Taiwan, but they're sort of testing the ground. In other words, they totally demolished the very principle of one country, two systems, what they've done in Hong Kong in recent years. Um, London's protested. We've issued visas for British overseas citizens for Hong Kongers, and there's been tensions between London and Beijing. But other than that, America's condemned it as well. But essentially, Beijing's got its way. Now, I think there may be fear in Taiwan of a lack of resolve from the West, and I think that a big factor here is President Macron's visit, where he's basically publicly stated that the EU, the West, shouldn't blindly follow what America's doing. I think this is extremely wrong-footed. I think he's echoing the sort of rhetoric of Charles de Gaulle about wanting to create a third pole away from the United States and China. But I think there's a very real risk here. He's going to look like a 21st century Neville Chamberlain. I mean, it's all very well sort of looking out for French national interests, which is, the domain of any leader to do. And I understand what he's saying about not blindly following America into everything. I mean, the French, for example, were right to take the position they did on the Iraq War. But when it comes to Taiwan, I think it sends out wholly the wrong message. I mean, Macron is wrong to say that it's totally irrelevant. If you don't even go along with the moral argument about defending a liberal democracy, um, then there's practical arguments. Taiwan is a major producer of um, digital products. It's a major electronics producer. Semiconductors are largely sourced from Taiwan. So even if you disregard the moral argument about standing up for a democracy, Taiwan can't be ignored because it's actually pretty important in that sense. So, if Europe just takes a blind eye and says, oh, well, we better not provoke the Chinese, they could do what they want, and it actually happens, I think the repercussions would be even bigger than the repercussions of the Ukraine war, potentially. Um, so this is a very serious situation. And I think, Macron tried the same approach with Russia. That's just, this idea of talking to Putin as if he was someone who could be reasoned with. I think Macron, I don't think he's a stupid man, actually. I think he's pretty smart, but I think he's trying to set up the false premise that talking to tyrants is the way forward. It's not. Both Moscow and Beijing have time and time and time again shown that they cannot be trusted. Um, and I think the point we've now come to a point where, short of fully recognizing Taiwanese independence, which probably would be provocative, I think we should definitely send out a message to Beijing. We shouldn't just leave it to the Americans. I think we should stand up for our values as well, in the sense of maybe we should issue an invitation deciding when to visit London. Of course, Beijing would have a tantrum, they'd complain. Um, but maybe we need to send out a strong message. But because this idea that, oh, it's just an internal Chinese affair is pandering to the Chinese narrative, and it's basically abandoning 28 million people to Beijing's will. And it sends out the wrong message that China can do as it wants in that region. I think that's wrong. Because if China is allowed to do as it pleases, we could be facing a very, very dystopian future. The whole world could. Because this is a power. It's I don't think you can overestimate the implications of this. Far worse than Russian domination. Russia's aggressive and, in my view, fascistic under Putin and dangerous. And at the moment, it has more nuclear warheads in China. But the thing about China is its economic weight. It's a much bigger country in terms of population. There's a lot of factors. The soft power politics going on. There's far more Chinese students in Western universities than Russian students. There's a lot of factors to consider. So I personally don't think we can ignore this. I'm not suggesting that we just say tomorrow, oh, we recognize Taiwan, or rather, we recognize Taipei over Beijing. But if things continue going the way they are, maybe there will come a point where we have to take quite a dramatic U-turn like that and say we no longer, um, well, that probably isn't realistic. But I just don't know if we could keep going down this path of saying we'll just work with the Chinese. I mean, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, he has taken a more hardline stance than some of his predecessors, but I think that the West is still very naive about China. I think there's still far too many institutions, shamefully, British universities. Frankly, a lot of university academics have shown cowardice by basically giving Beijing what it wants. I think just collectively we need to be aware that this is a regime that cannot be trusted. I don't think we can totally cut off um, communist China. We can't. It's the world's second most powerful country, the world's second biggest economy. It may well surpass the American economy in the next 10 years. So it's clearly cannot be ignored. But the problem with bullies is if you just give them what they want, they will keep taking more and keep pushing harder. This is what we've seen with the so-called wolf warrior diplomats. I remember back in the 2000s, there were always tensions over things like human rights, but at least the Chinese diplomats sort of had a degree of diplomacy, right? Today they don't even bother. It's just this hawkish, belligerent language almost all the time. Xi Jinping has personally shown that repeatedly. So I think we really need to say we're not going to be pushed around. I think when Beijing uses belligerent language, we should throw it right back at them. That's for people like Victor Gao, Chinese nationalists who are living and working in the West. I think they should be basically grilled every time the opportunity arises, put on the spot, forced to defend um, their militant views. So that's my thoughts on it. I think basically some sort of invitation deciding when to come to London would be appropriate. Send out a message to Beijing that actually you can't push us around, and we can invite anyone we want to this country as a sovereign state. That's our domain. Um, it's very clear that the vast majority of Taiwanese people do not want to live under communism. There'll be a minority who do, as there were in Hong Kong, but this attitude of Taiwan is ours, the rest of the world should mind its own business, and the hell with the Taiwanese people, is not a convincing argument. If Beijing really wants to get the world on its side, it should show, promote positive image of the Taiwanese people. Threatening to rain down missiles on their cities is not exactly the way to do that. I mean, imagine if the British government, seriously, imagine this, if the British government threatened to rain down missiles on Glasgow and Edinburgh. That would be unthinkable. It would be obscene. It won't happen. So this whole idea of, I mean, China talks about one country, two systems. What it really means is one country, one system. That's what we've seen from Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong is a big red flag here, no pun intended. Big red flag. So, yeah, I think we need to basically take a tough line with this. I think Macron is wrong. I don't think it's just someone else's business. This doesn't mean, for example, let's just find ways to provoke Beijing, but we have to stand up for our values. And we cannot constantly be walking on eggshells regarding Chinese sensitivities. Because Taiwan is the only Chinese speaking democracy. And I really think that I think President Tsai Ing-wen deserves enormous respect. I think she's courageous. One of the world leaders I most respect at the moment. Um, and there may come a point where we have to, at the very least, maybe recognize Taiwanese independence, if not the narrative that it's the one true representative of China. Of course, there's internal party politics in this. The Kuomintang, incidentally, under Chiang Kai-shek, was a pretty bad dictatorship. It was almost as bad as the communists. It was also covered in blood. But the difference between Taiwan and mainland China is the Taiwanese actually evolved into a genuine democracy. And it's one of the most progressive parts of the world in every conceivable way. Human Development Index, democracy, freedom of press, um, technology, you name it. Um, Also, they supported us during the pandemic. They sent thousands and thousands of masks. So we have good relations with Taipei. At the moment, all we have is a representative in London. Maybe it's time to promote that a little bit more. I know the Taiwanese delegation were invited to the Queen's state funeral. That was a good move. Anything that sends out a message that we're not seeing Taiwan, it's just a Chinese province, that, to kowtow to Beijing's narrative is a good thing, short of fully saying, okay, Taiwan's the only representative of China. That wouldn't be practical and it wouldn't be sensible. But I do think there's going to come a point where we can't ignore this. Now, Britain may not be a Pacific power, but if we want any sort of leadership role in the world, we cannot ignore this. And I think Macron is dead wrong. I think Sunak needs to make some sort of stance on this.